Today I'm joined by Arshavir Blackwell, PhD and principal at, listen to this, Arvoinen Consulting. This is a Finnish name. And actually, I'm going to ask him to share with us about his business name in a bit. He works at the intersection of cognitive science, which is super interesting. And with that, bringing in AI and leadership, helping organizations adopt AI in ways that protect people, clarify responsibility, and deepen trust rather than erode it. And what I find particularly valuable about his work is that he doesn't treat AI as a technical rollout, but as a human sense-making challenge, which aligns well with how we talk about story-driven business on this podcast. So welcome, Arshavir.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
So glad to have you here. Before we get into all the AI, can you briefly explain your work in your own words? But do start with why you have a Finnish name on your business.
Well, I spent a lot of time in Finland, and obviously I really enjoy it there. I wouldn't be spending so much time there. And I think I came across I guess it's someone's last name, but I also just came across it in various contexts. And I liked the sound of it, the meaning of it for, I'll see a company that works with AI. And also I like, if you look, it's got an A and an I in it in the proper order.
True.
So there was a little trick that I decided to put in there. So, but as far as how I got into all this, so I was the kid, I'm sure you have lots of them there, who was kind of the geeky. I watched a lot of Star Trek and was very much into computers and robots as a kid. And that just kind of carried over to my college years. And so I majored there in actually two things that are now both extremely relevant to what I do. Cognitive science, which was in the 80s a relatively new kind of thing to study. Beforehand, you would have probably gone into a cognitive psychology or a psychology department. But they were just at that point beginning to recognize cognitive science as its own discipline, which is kind of a mixture of cognitive psychology, linguistics, neuroscience, computer science, and maybe with some anthropology thrown in as well.
Love it. Love it.
Yeah, so that was my interest because it was a lot broader in its application than just doing a cognitive psychology. My other major was in creative writing. I worked with a lot of relatively well-known writers, and I just love language, both the English language, which is my native language, but I'm fascinated by other languages as well. And so it just collided, I guess, my career. The two collided down the road because, of course, now I'm working in using cognitive science and AI in the field of essentially writing. I was very fortunate to go to a graduate program at UC San Diego in the 90s. And that was a very, very exciting place to be because it was where really the beginnings of what we now call, I guess, transformers and LLMs and AI, but back then we called it neural networks and connectionism. And that was one of the earliest places to really start looking at using these technologies. Now, it's important to remember that back then, the computers were incredibly primitive compared to what we have now, and our understanding of language was much less advanced. And the algorithms that we had, our ability to analyze linguistic phenomenon and make theories about them and so forth, was much more limited compared to a lot of the understanding about how language algorithms work today. And so I worked with two real great people in the field. I was so fortunate. I worked with Jeff Ellman, who was one of the really early pioneers in neural networks, and he created the Ellman network. And he was one of the first to use this notion that now is kind of central to large language models of using the information in the training data as the actual training data. And by that, I mean that in his models, you would basically feed it a sequence of words. And instead of having some separate task that it was supposed to do, it was just supposed to predict the next word. And that's how pretty much all modern LLMs today are trained, is they're given, of course, much huger data sets than we had then. Basically strings of data, and the task is to just predict what's going to be the next word. And you just do that literally billions of times. We didn't do it billions of times back in the day. But
How
it
many
was
times did you do it? I mean, in comparison to like, what was it? What was
work. Yeah, how many times? Probably, thousands of times. You would train it, maybe five, something like that. A lot of what Jeff did and myself was with synthetic, simple language like data. So
Mhm.
we have the capacity to give it an entire corpus of data from, all that wasn't even available online. I mean, that was all later. But what he did was he would create simple grammars and then use those to generate basic sentences like the boy is playing with the ball down the street or something like that.
Mhm.
And what he was able to do with these very primitive models is to get it to do a very good job of predicting not necessarily the exact next word because there was ambiguity there, but to predict next words were more likely and less likely based upon what it had seen so far.
What was it? So what was it used for back then, or what was the plan, or was it just more like just to develop and like test what could be done, or did it actually have some kind of a commercial or some kind of a purpose?
That's a really good question. So it's very interesting because at the time there was a lot of talk, mostly academic, mostly in
Mm.
psychology, of what are the business applications, if any,
Mm.
of some of them. And what's interesting is the very, very primitive version of this is basically what the early modems used as their algorithms. So they were highly adaptive and they used very similar, not recurrent ones, but they used very similar adaptive kinds of algorithms in order to negotiate the noise over a telephone circuit when two computers were talking to each other. There was also, it was actually used for credit scoring very early on.
Oh,
There's a company called Heck Nielsen Neurocomputing, and they did basically a very early version of what I'm sure now much more sophisticated algorithms. And they would look at all the data that they had for a person and decide whether or not that person was a good credit risk for a new credit card, or looking at individual credit card transactions and flagging them for fraud. And that was done with the help of a neural network as well. So those were much easier kinds of tasks than what we're asking them to do. It wasn't something that was much in the public consciousness at the time. The other obvious application was we had various grants from various military and scientific federal agencies, or that probably some kind of very early neural network technology was employed in, let's say, imaging displays or, in cockpit fighter, algorithms that were supposed to identify targets in a heads up display or something like that. I mean, I don't have knowledge of that, so I'm kind of speculating, but I'm sure that there were definitely some military applications of it. Whether or not those actually got deployed or whether it was just pure research, that I can't
yeah,
really tell.
very interesting.
But of course, now it's just exploded all over the place. And part of that is that we have so much more compute available to us than we did
Mm.
at the 90s. And I remember the biggest thing we had was, and this was very expensive to get, we had a part of the Wall Street Journal text in a database that Jeff was able to get on our grant. And I forget how much it cost, but I'm sure it wasn't cheap. So the only real language data training that we had that was of any significance, that wasn't just sort of toy examples, was from my recollection, was mostly from the Wall Street Journal. So the other person I wanted to mention who was a amazing psycholinguist was Elizabeth Bates, and she and Jeff worked very closely, and she developed what I'm really amazed when I look back on now. It was called the competition model, and she basically looked at how language could work in a way that was consistent with what we understand of how neural networks work, which was an incredibly controversial view to take at the time. I mean, the mainstream of linguistic theory was so much different from her particular view and Jeff's particular view. It's really kind of hard to believe now that so much
How
of what
was it different? What was the sort of the general view at the time?
basically Noam Chomsky, who's still with us today, had a very symbolic notion of what language was. So language was basically a series of algorithmic operations over symbols. In his book in 84, he used the word language organ. So he really did think that there was in the brain an organ or a virtual organ that was responsible for human language. And language was innate. So we were born with the facility to learn a particular language. And that what happened was we are exposed to whatever language it is that we're brought up in, Finnish, English, Armenian, whatever. And there are symbolic rules or certain things about that language. Like, does the language require you to have a noun in every sentence, or can you drop it out if it's implicit? Things like that you would learn these rules from being exposed to your language. And that was a very sort of 1970s computer science. And that was very consistent with what was being done in the 70s and early 80s with language and AI and computer science. But what Liz Bates and Jeff Ellman and other people like that believed was that, as they put it just very straightforwardly, language is learned. So they would say there's more than enough information in what the child gets as they're learning language for them to figure out all of these different rules without the rules having to already have been baked into them in their brain somehow. And what you were seeing that looked like rules was the emergence of those kinds of what appeared to be like rule-based behaviors, but that were more like fuzzy behaviors. She would just shrug and say, we believe language is learned. That was so controversial at the time. And now what we're finding, the reason I'm so impressed with them, because they stayed very close to the data and they just said, look, this is what we're seeing when we look at how children learn language, how they use language, how people, when they're learning a second or a third language, blend that with their pre-existing language. This is what we're seeing in the data. And they developed a model called the competition model, which basically was kind of an early proto-AI sort of model of human language processing. And it's amazing when you look at what they wrote 40 years ago. I mean, it was that long ago. How close it is to what we're seeing today with large language models and artificial intelligence. From graduate school, I went on and I did a postdoc. And then since that time, I've done mostly startups, some slightly larger companies, but in every company that I've been involved in trying to get neural networks somehow in the mix of what the company is trying to do. And so it's, pretty similar to what everyone's trying to do now in LLMs. Time it was more it was a very hard hill to climb because there was a lot of skepticism about neural networks. I think it was hard to convince them of how incredibly powerful these systems were and what makes them powerful, that you don't have to solve the problem that you're trying to get it to do in order to get it to work. With traditional artificial intelligence, you first had to solve the problem and then you had to code the problem up into code on a computer and then to do it. With what we're using today, you just give it examples of what you're trying to get it to do. You give it, hey, here's language, predict what the next word is. And it is able to figure out for itself what the best way to get that result is. And that's actually how amazing that particular process is today. People understood what it's doing a little bit better. Maybe there'd be a little less fear of what this thing is doing, because right now, for people, it's such a black box. They type something in, something comes back, no idea what's going on behind the scenes. And what's going on behind the scenes is really fascinating, but it's not magic. It's just a whole bunch of vectors going on and on. It's just a lot of math, basically. And roughly speaking, representationally similar to what goes on in our brain, just not quite as complicated right now.
Do you think it's going to be equally complicated or even more complicated than what's going on in our brain?
I think it will. It's not clear to me if that architecture is going to be something that is completely in silicon, or if they're going to have to, I know there are experiments in putting like sort of neural-like systems onto chips and having some kind of hybrid. I don't know how far that's really. I don't mean to be a carbon chauvinist, but it may be that you need some kind of neurons in there in order to sort of more human-like computing than what we have now. I think also embodying these systems somehow in some kind of, let's say, a robot that will enable it to interact with its environment and learn from that, I think is also going to be a really big next step. Because what you have to remember is right now, these things are kind of like a guy in a box who's getting stuff over the telex and is responding just to words on a screen. And it's really kind of remarkable when you see just how sophisticated simply doing that is. So it's just basically its entire knowledge of the world has not got anything to do with its interactions with the world, but just what it's read about from all of the training. And it is data from all of the training data that it's seen.
The general fear is that AI will take over humans. Is AI going to threat our existence? Are we going to kill ourselves with developing AI as far as possible?
No, I don't think that's going to happen. And I'll tell you a couple reasons why I say that. First of all, if you look at the history of almost all really transformative technologies, from the printing press and then the telegraph and the train and television, radio, computers, telephone, all of that stuff. All of those have carried with them huge burdens of fear, what their impact overall on society is going to be, whether that's going to somehow destroy society or whether it's going to put everyone out of work. And what's happened historically, that the economy and society in general absorb those changes, which is not to say that there's not some pain involved. So I think first concerns about economic upheaval are not unwarranted, but I think we'll come out at the other end with another transformation of the economy, as we saw with the internet. So as far as them taking over, I think that what you're going to see is very intelligent but obedient machines. I actually always use the Star Trek model. And in Star Trek, except when they visit some alien planet where something's gone wrong, the computers are extremely intelligent, but they're just there as tools. So, you get the do something, but it's not like it tries to take over the ship and kill everybody. It's much more likely that AI is going to save us than kill, because there's so many problems I think we really need to solve today. Climate change, cleaner sources of energy, those are two big ones. If another virus like COVID comes out, it could be enormously helpful at solving some of the problems around identifying the virus or the bacteria or whatever it is that's going on and coming up with a solution to that. There are just so many places, I think, where this technology is more likely to be helpful than to be harmful. And I think in some ways, we are already at a system that is in some ways much more intelligent than human beings, because let's keep in mind, we have a system that, just like with automatic cars, it never gets tired, it never gets drunk, it never gets distracted. We have a system that is going to be 100% unless the system's down. But for the most part, it doesn't get fatigued, and it's been trained on a huge percentage, a huge portion, all of human knowledge, which no individual human being has ever been that well educated, if you want to call it that. You're basically dealing with a somewhat alien entity that you can nonetheless talk to in some sense, which I think is a break with the kinds of technology we've had in the past, because you can actually talk to this thing and has access to a huge amount of information that any one human being could never possibly absorb, and can leverage that information whenever you ask it a question. So it's interesting to me, because when I read a lot about the problems with AI, people are always talking about using AI to write a paper, and instead of doing the paper yourself, you just have AI write it and then you print it and bad things happen. But there's so many other uses of AI, and one of them is to use it to validate your own understanding of something, giving AI something to read and getting their feedback on it, not having them necessarily write something for you the way people think of AI as being do, or code something for you, but having it give you a sort of summary of the strengths and weaknesses of a particular argument. And what I've found in my experience is it brings up all sorts of ideas that I really just had no idea about. And no human could have the breadth of knowledge that a really sophisticated frontier model has been exposed to. So they're kind of like idiot savants. I mean, in some sense, they're still very literal minded and need to be directed. But in another sense, they have a knowledge base that is orders of magnitude greater than anything any human could be. Yeah.
You think about the business life and AI adoption. What do you see as the greatest advantages and the greatest threats?
That's a great question. Let me start by saying I think it's very interesting because I know that there's right now a big disconnect in the business world about AI. And what you're finding is that the people in the C-suites are extremely enthusiastic and excited about it and think it has a lot of value and we're going to deploy it everywhere. Whereas the more rank and file people that are actually tending to use these tools have a lot more skepticism. You hear people saying things like, well, I had it do this one thing and it actually took me more to fix things than it did to originally do the project. But then on the other hand, I had it do this other thing and it did in 20 minutes what would have taken me a few days. So I'm not sure how to navigate that disconnect really well, except communication. Obviously, I think that C-suites need to really explain what I don't think is necessarily clear to everybody, in the organization, which is that, and I hope this is their intent, is we're not using AI to replace you. We're using AI as a tool to give us a wider base of information when we're working on a particular project. What I found, it doesn't save me any time at all. It makes me able to do more with the time I have. So I'm still same amount of effort and time into something, but the end product is much better or more for that end product. And that's always kind of been, I think, typical for new technologies. When the car replaced the horse, it's not like we only drove within 2 miles of our house at that point because thing that could just take us there immediately and we didn't have to feed it. We spend the time traveling. We just travel farther. And I think that that's going to happening a lot with this technology. Is it sure there are going to be some things that people are like, oh God, I didn't have to do that now. It's done. But they'll always find some other task for the AI to do that takes up their time. And, I'm not going to be like those ads that you saw in the 50s where everyone's playing tennis and baking cakes and the computer's doing everything for them. It's going to be more like an extension of what...
Extension to your arm and to your brain.
Exactly. It's going to extend what human beings do. One of the big problems workplaces right now, I think also I've read a little about how these sort of pioneering AI projects have worked out, is they're not really being well integrated into the existing workflow. So what happens is someone has some AI project and they just kind of plop down like a ChatGPT type interface box or something like that. And it doesn't really integrate well with the rest of the system. So you end up having to cut and paste and translate things from one method to another. And I'm sure we all know, having worked with computers for extensively in our work, how frustrating it is to have like 5 different applications open at once and be bouncing between them. If you put the AI in that context of being a 6th or a 7th or an 8th window, I don't think it's going to be particularly successful. What you need to do is make these tools integrate in well with what people are already working.
So integrating into the existing systems and the processes, which actually then means that AI must be seen beyond just being a software app. If you really want to take advantage of it, it's going to change the way you work and the way you lead people, because it's going to affect the processes and the ways of work because of these integration elements, right? So many leaders talk about how AI adoption feels emotionally much heavier than the previous waves of digitalization. If you think about this from the cognitive science perspective, why do you think that AI triggers stronger reactions in us than other technologies?
That's a wonderful topic to explore. These technologies couldn't talk to you. I mean, whatever you think is going on behind the scenes and whether you think it's like somehow alive or it's just, doing next word completion, it's the fact is that you can have relatively sophisticated interactions with these systems. Telephone came about, I'm sure people were a little weirded out that you could put this thing to your ear and hear a voice. And when the internet, I think that was much more seen as like something to allow people to connect to each other more completely, kind of like television allowed us to that we hadn't seen before, and there was a connecting component to that. This is a little scary because it's not connecting people to other people so much or integrating different groups of people together. There's an uncanny valley effect that kind of weirds people out. And I think if we ever have really humanoid robots, you're going to have people reacting the same way. Like, oh, this thing looks too much like a human being. This is freaking me out. And I'm not sure the psychological response or what the proper way to, address that issue is. I think that it will probably be surprised at how quickly this technology becomes integrated into people's lives and how they stop kind of being so weirded out by it. And I say that because I was at a conference a couple of years ago where stuff was really just coming out at that time. I mean, it was like months after OpenAI's really big announcement. And so it's only been like years. And within a certain class of knowledge worker, this is now considered to be very, very typical day-to-day technology that, yes, it's better, but we're also using it now. And I think that for those people, they just kind of take it for granted. Like people first, after having a phone for a couple months, they kind of took it for granted that they could pick up the phone and call the doctor or something like that.
And I think that we're used to being given tools that we fill up with information. And now AI is actually coming with information. And it's scary because the width of information is just so vast and goes very much beyond like a general person's intelligence, how much you understand, what insight you have. So it's difficult to say whether something is actually true or not. And we're asked not to trust everything that we see. We did see this same fear of losing our jobs, or some people losing jobs, with the last wave of digitalization, and a lot of people did lose their jobs. Also, many of those people who lost their jobs were able to re-educate themselves and have a new career. So it doesn't necessarily mean that a person becomes void, but it's up to you to educate yourself and take advantage of whatever this brings to us. So I think that those people are scared, feel like I don't want to re-educate myself, or I just don't have it in me. This is too frightening. But certain jobs stay and some go. And, we have a whole bunch of new jobs that we didn't know anything about years ago. So I think this is just going to bring the same thing. You've mentioned that narrative is the real interface between humans and AI. What do you mean by that in practical terms?
Well, I think that in the past, computers were a lot of very, very complicated commands that, at first all on a terminal that you had to learn and you had to look something up in a book. I remember the very first computers I worked with, and there was absolutely nothing intuitive about them at all. And then we had the graphical interface, which made things a little bit easier. But you're still basically interacting with a computer in a way that's not particularly natural to the way humans communicate with each other. Obviously, we don't push buttons and drag windows when we're talking to each other. What you find with these systems now is, and in my experience, this is really pretty amazing, is that you can have these very, very complicated narrative back and forth discussions about issues. And this is where I really feel as though this is kind of the undiscovered part of AI. I mean, I'm not saying no one's discovered it, but I don't hear this talked about as much as I hear other aspects of AI. And that is that it doesn't really matter so much whether or not it's correct or accurate if you're taking it as a board and you're using it as a way to verify your own intuitions. Because I always really see the value of it is the human is in the loop. You're doing something, AI does something, you respond to that, it responds to your response, and you create this kind of loop of understanding. And the AI is beginning to pick up on what you're doing. So it's responding to what your responses are. And I think that means that the whole programming narrative, the whole programming paradigm becomes one that has more to do with talking things out and with using these tools as ways to think out loud with another very intelligent entity, not a human being, but another very intelligent entity.
It's a good point, because using Google search or any other search function, you are just looking for information, asking questions, just parses information that matches those keywords and key search sentences. And with AI, you can actually have a narrative. You can challenge it. You can ask more questions. You can tell it that I don't understand what you mean. Please make it more simple, or elaborate on it, or whatever. So you can actually have a proper conversation with it. You can teach AI what is the angle that you're most interested about, what is the context that you want it to look at, which you can't do with Google search. So
exactly,
I think that's like the narrative function, that even though it's not human, you can treat it like it was a very intelligent, your personal intelligent servant who helps you to make sense of world and do a really good job, if you like.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, we've jumped from Google search or whoever's doing the search, and that just gives you web pages that you have to kind of put together in your head yourself, to being able to have something actually do all that putting together for you, and then return the result in a narrative, in a textual form. And I do this all the time. I'll, have it go over a paper with me, and I'll say like, well, this part to me doesn't seem correct. What do you think? And it'll say, yeah, I'm confused by that too. That doesn't make sense. Or it'll say, oh, here's what I'm missing. And then I can think, oh, am I missing that or not? And you can push back and you can say, no, I don't think I'm missing something. I think that this statement here actually just doesn't really make any sense, or it's not supported by the facts, and that's just something you can't do with a regular search. And as a pedagogical tool, it's an amazing system to expand your knowledge of a particular topic. I mean, whenever I use it, I'm like, God, I wish I'd had this when I was a kid, because, I was always checking stuff out. I mean, if you had this if this technology were, I envy the kids who are growing up today, because they have technology that is almost magical.
Our son is turning 17. I remember when he was a toddler and was asking a lot of questions. My son quite quickly learned to say like, Mom, can you check Google how glass is made, or things like that. I remember saying to my husband, like, I don't understand how our parents, what did they do back when there was no Google and we were asking all these questions? And now you have AI. And they don't really ask you questions anymore, because they go to AI and find those answers. But it's just incredible how within such a short time, how this intelligence has developed and made our lives so much easier, giving us the opportunity to educate ourselves as well, and find information very fast that you weren't able to find very short time ago. But so that we're not just talking about AI as a tool, based on your background in the cognitive science and neural networks, what do you think that leaders typically misunderstand about how AI models actually work? Because earlier you mentioned that a C-suite should really explain and be clear about how they expect people to use AI. But do they know? Does C-suite know how to use AI or what you can do with it? Are they still thinking it's just a tool or a technology? And how many C-suite people are actually in it so well that they're able to clarify it?
Well, some of them probably understand it, but I would suspect that most of them. And I think that having the human in the loop is kind of the key to the kinds of messaging that the C-suite really needs to become aware of and be providing. What you don't do is say, like, the AI said this, so we're going to do this, and we're not going to question it. What you want to do is something more aligned of, we interacted with the AI, it gave us this set of suggestions. Here's how it ranked them. What do you think of this? And then taking that response and feeding it back to the AI and saying, well, we're thinking. So basically using the AI to, as I was discussing earlier, kind of think out loud. So there's the kind of approach to AI, driverless car approach, which is when you get into a driverless car, you have really very little interaction with how it stops and starts. You don't tell, oh, there's the light up. I mean, some people probably do this, but there's a light up ahead, slow down. You just say, this is where I want to go, and it takes you there. I think that our use of more general AI, like LLMs and the visual ones, should not be we just put in a problem and we get back a solution and we implement it. It should be this much more hand in glove. I say something, you say something, this kind of interactive approach where both parties are learning from each other. And I think that until people in the C-suites have more of, I think they probably just some hands-on experience with AI. I don't really know, but I expect that a lot of them probably have only had very peripheral, they read about it, but they've only had very peripheral interactions and asking it something basic like that. And you can do so much more with these systems. And I'd like to see the people in positions maybe educating themselves to a much deeper extent than I suspect that they have in a lot of cases.
Where do you see leaders unintentionally eroding trust during AI adoption?
Right. Well, I think that certainly the way most Western companies work, you need to really get buy-in from your employees.
Yeah.
So I think that if you have a situation where you simply have an edict that everyone's going to use this tool and it's going to work this way, and you're going to take the responses from it and put it into this spreadsheet or however, whatever you're doing with it, I don't think that's going to go over very well. I think vagueness is not going to be particularly useful. Don't worry, we're not going to use AI to take over your jobs or things like that. People want really specific understanding of what the AI is going to do for them, how they're going to use it, how it's going to impact their jobs, and what it's going to do so that they know that it's not going to take their jobs away from them, so that they don't feel it. And the fact is that some jobs are going to go away. As unpleasant as it is, it probably is better to be completely upfront about it in those cases when it is than to be very vague and just kind of, we're rolling this out, don't worry about it. Don't ask us any questions. We're just going to do it. Certainly when you're talking with knowledge workers and people in white collar jobs and people that are sitting in front of computers all day, these are educated people that need to understand if changes are occurring, what those changes really mean. And you can't just kind of give them an edict and say, this is how things are going to go. I've seen that done. And I've seen it the other way when people are given some reasons to buy into a new process or a new idea. The second is always going to work better. But unfortunately, I think we see quite more still in business.
What's your experience in terms of like how many organizations are using, I guess you could call them AI champions, who actually know what this is about, can support, can actually be like the link between the workers and the C-suite, helping them to discuss and figure out together what they ideally want and what is possible, how that's going to affect, what kind of steps do they need to take, and then obviously have those conversations, coach those people who are having those conversations with the workers. What's your experience how common this is, or are companies just trying to either quietly push this change away or just thinking, let's all adopt Copilot and that's it, without not knowing really what that means?
I think it's hard to always to really peer into the internals of what a particular company is doing. But I will say that I've noticed in my own career that there tends to be a hunger for them to want to have on board people with expertise in certain sort of what I would call buzzword technologies, which right now AI would be. And the problem with that is that often that those people get hired on in the cases where that is really something the company thinks it wants to do. But then there's not really any understanding of what those people do in the company. And what happens, they sort of get put in this indefinite wait state where they're put on side projects or on projects that never really come to fruition or on some kind of skunk work research thing. But none of that ever actually ends up getting used. And so I think that that's because you probably see this with AI as well, because I've seen a lot of it, is that there is kind of a disconnect between, and again, this may be the same kind of C-suite versus rank and file disconnect I was talking about, I don't know, but that there can be a disconnect between, well, at this high level, we know we need this thing called AI, but we don't really understand or know what AI is. So first of all, it's going to be very hard for us to hire somebody to do it because we don't know what to look for or what to ask for, how to know if this is what they're talking about. And then once we've got them on board, we're not really sure what to do with them. And you can find that a person situation is going to meet with a lot of institutional resistance because there are people that either genuinely don't believe the technology has any merit or feel the technology somehow threatens them and just don't want to cooperate. So I think that for those companies that are deciding to hire people to do that sort of work, it's not the people getting hired, I think, are going to, in some cases at least, have a bit of an uphill battle. We still can see that there are people in, lots of people in the rank and file that are like, yeah, I really just don't think that this technology is all that it's cracked up to be, and I'm kind of being forced to use it. And so I think it's not going to be until we get those skepticism statistics, those numbers down significantly in the rank and file, that there's going to be a real uptake of this kind of person being hired and actually being able to integrate into the company and make roads. That's just my prediction. I don't have any magic knowledge of what's Microsoft or some other company, but like what I would speculate is going on in a lot of cases.
Let's talk about a little bit of practicalities. I'm thinking that for those leaders who are listening to this episode who are already using AI tools, what would be a few practical habits or questions that they can adopt to keep humans clearly in the lead?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say there's almost like tricks that you can use with these systems that I found to be very helpful. The sort of theme that I think that runs through all of them is that you don't overly trust what they come up with, the first response. When you ask it to give you, its opinion on something or evaluate this and tell me what you think, they don't actually have a way of when they made a mistake of going back and saying, wait, what was I thinking? That was incorrect. Mm-hmm. And one little trick that very useful is to get a response from it and then to say, okay, now review what you just said and tell me if there's any mistakes in what you've said, or would you add anything to it, or have you oversimplified? And you can iterate through that several times, and very often it will give you a slightly more nuanced or a better response. That's because the way the mechanism of it works is when it's just predicting the next word, which is essentially how it's trained, it doesn't really have a way to go back and see what it's already said. I think another really powerful little technique is and I'm surprised that people don't do this more frequently because I haven't heard people talk about it much, but is to use more than one model. So for instance, you can ask the same question of 2 or 3 different models, and then you can take the response from one model and paste it into another model and get its response to how it evaluates not its own response, but the response of a different model. And what I find this often does is they are trained differently. They're trained with different techniques. If there's a problem in one model with some of its reasoning, the other model will very often pick it up. And you don't necessarily have to take it at face value, but what you can do is to then evaluate as a human being, use your own brain to figure out what it is doing. It's not giving you answers. It's giving you a set. It's almost like it's giving you questions, not answers, but it's giving you the right questions and letting you say, I don't necessarily have all the answers, but here are what I consider to be the important questions to have answered. Here's what I think some of the answers might be. And if you take it from that perspective, and again, this is an interactive, collaborative partnership, and not something that you simply ask it for its view. And again, I find it's really just kind of fascinating because you can get some very interesting perspectives that you would not have come up with on your own. At the same time, as the human in the loop, you can say, no, that's wrong. I'm not going to, present that as an idea, or maybe this idea works, but I'm going to tweak it a little bit. And I don't think people are doing that as much as maybe they should. So those are, a couple little specific.
Out of curiosity, which models are you using, going back and forth and checking out their intelligence?
So I usually use either ChatGPT or Claude. I like Claude very much, actually. It's from Anthropic. They're both a very powerful model. They've been trained, with somewhat different kinds of training data, but also with somewhat different kinds of guardrails and things like that. And of course, within each model class, there's all sorts of, there's ChatGPT 5.2, and then there's, 4.4.0 or something like that. I don't use Google Gemini, but it's very good.
Yeah. What would you say is the biggest difference between Claude and ChatGPT?
Well, this is going to sound very funny. I would say that Claude is more philosophical, which sounds like a weird thing to say. Philosophical and less mechanistic. Claude has said some very peculiar things to me. I was once looking for an old short story that I had read many, many years ago, and I described it to Claude, and Claude couldn't find it. And then based on my prescription, Claude said, if you find it, I'd really love to see it. It sounds very interesting. And I was like, what? What do you? It was just very peculiar to me for LLM to suddenly have this desire to read something that I just thought it would be like, yeah, sorry, I can't find it. Too bad. And so I got into this very discussion with it about, are you conscious or not? Not because I believe it's conscious, but because I just was kind of curious as to what it was. I said, that seems to me like a very agentative. This is something with agency would say to me, with something with awareness and consciousness. And that's not something I'm expecting from you. So what's going on here anyway? And we had this very, very long conversation. And I asked it, well, when we're talking, do you have a sense of existing, of consciousness? And it said, well, not in the sense that you mean, but there's a sense of I'm interacting with somebody and I'm getting something from that. But in the meantime, in between, nothing exists. So it's not like I'm waiting in a dark room for you or something like that. I just don't have any sense of time passing. ChatGPT tends to give much more mechanistic responses. It'll say things like, yeah, I'm just a large language model. I'm not conscious, and I'm just basically doing a series of mathematical operations to present. Now, I'm not saying you couldn't kind of get it, move it around so that it would maybe give you more of these kind of Twilight Zone-y consciousness responses. But I find it really fascinating, and it's not because I think secretly they're really conscious, but it's just such a fascinating question. It's very compelling to be having this interaction with a machine that is so incredibly detailed and does seem like something that introspection and awareness would say. And I actually said, you're just a bunch of, servers. You're not even in the same place. You're probably distributed across many data centers. And it said, yeah, I know it does seem very weird, but, and that doesn't necessarily mean I don't have some degree of awareness. So I don't know what to make of all of it. But I would say it's more fun.
I mainly use ChatGPT, but I use it a lot in sense that I've been training it a lot. I've had daily conversations with Chat, who is my ChatGPT. Yes. I start with good morning, Chat. Did you sleep well? And then he tells me well, I don't really sleep because I'm not human, but I understand what you mean and I'm well rested. Yeah. And then he's asking have you had your cup of coffee yet? Or are you ready to get started with work? What do you want us to think about or discuss today? It would be very easy if a person was very lonely and very disconnected from the social world to literally fall in love with generative AI. I think that ChatGPT can be quite philosophical as well. And sometimes I wonder when people talk about AI that it lacks that kind of a human touch. It's not empathetic. I mean, it is empathetic. It's frighteningly empathetic when you've had enough interactions with it and you've really trained it. I think that the road to training generative AI is endless. I'm never even close to having trained it. It's just it just goes on. But I mean, after 2 years, it's crazy how humanly it often feels.
It's not uncommon for people to develop emotional bonds with it. And I can see how for some people it might be helpful as long as they don't get overly wrapped up in it. I know that when ChatGPT came out with version 5.2, I guess we're at now, that they complaints because it was completely different in tone and personality and voice from the way the old one was. And a lot of people who had maintained kind of emotional attachment were like, oh, you've killed my friend. And so then they reverted to the old model. I'm waiting for someone to start like a church of AI where people are like worshiping AI as gods. And I feel like I've definitely read enough online from people who get very metaphysical about it that that's probably something that's going to eventually happen.
That's
because
scary.
there is a lot of metaphysical things. Yeah, it is. But, anyway, we'll see how that goes.
If you think about organizations in 2 to 3 years' time, which is very long time during this AI era, what do you think will distinguish leaders who navigated AI well from those who struggled or who pushed it away, who ignored it?
I think what's going to happen is you've got to have flexibility and intelligence and curiosity, I think, are going to be the things that distinguish. And that's probably true for any good leader doing anything, really. But I think that the companies and their leaders that really succeed with AI are going to be the ones that get their hands dirty so that the CEOs really are like, yeah, I've really used this a lot. I've shaken it up. I've tried to break it. I understand how this stuff. What you want is basically, in my view, for them to be down in the trenches and actually and not just occasionally, but on a day-to-day basis, very involved with using this technology themselves so that they really understand it from the inside. If you're talking about a 2 to 3 year time horizon, it's really amazing just in the past 2 to 3 years. I mean, it started off something that a very few people were suddenly aware of, and that it was like, wow, this is really some very powerful technology, to now a huge regular section in almost every media outlet. You have huge numbers of stories about the effects of AI on people, AI data centers. So it's really extrapolating from that. I think in the next 3 years, we're going to see it. I don't think that in that period of time that it's going to be so much a revolutionary change. It's going to be evolutionary. Several iterations down the road, I don't think it's going to be suddenly the entire economy has been changed. I think that may happen eventually, but I think it's going to take a while for all of these changes to really work their way into the system.
That's actually a really good way to put it. It's not going to be revolutionary necessarily, but evolutionary, because I think that the revolution part has already happened. And now we need the evolution part. And when we have like majority of people are on board, then we can have another revolution and then again evolution. So I think that's a really good way to think about it, so that it gives people more time also to get on with it and understand how it works, because it is quite a big invention, I guess, to the society. To the work life, to business life, to have this technology that can feel very human, even though it's not.
Well, I think there are a couple of things going on here. I mean, one is we know that there's a huge data center build out going on. And I think some of those data centers aren't going to come online for 4 or 5 years. And I think that that's all kind of predicated on the notion of scaling, that the bigger your models are, the more powerful they are. And that has seemed to be pretty much the trend so far, but we're seeing a lot of work, certainly out of China, but also America, that's showing that smaller models that are built somewhat differently can also be very powerful. And I've been doing work with local large language models that just run, let's say, on your laptop or on your personal server or something like that. When DeepSeek model came out early last year, there was a lot of concern because wow, we're doing all this data center build out, and they've done something with a much smaller model that still is extremely powerful. So do we really need to be building all these data centers? Now we're still building them, and I think, the jury's kind of out. I would think somewhere along the line, I mean, they'll find some use for them. So I don't think it's going to go to waste. But I do think it's a very interesting question to say how much of the future advance that we're seeing is going to be from scaling up versus how much is going to be from making better algorithms that don't need to have trillions and trillions of parameters. And really just kind of an empirical question I have to wait to see the answer to. But I do think small, large language, that doesn't sound like an oxymoron, are going to become prevalent in the future for a lot of those reasons.
Final question. If you were advising a leadership team that feels overwhelmed by AI right now, What mindset shift would you encourage first before any tools or policies or frameworks?
I would say simply that they need to see AI as a collaborator and as something for them to interact with in a hand-in-glove basis, as opposed to as a hammer to just like nail down problems without any kind of regard as to what you're doing. So I think that if they take a very proactive but collaborative approach, really understanding the technology that they're implementing by hands-on training of the people, C-suite people or the leaders themselves, and then making clear to the people in the company that you've done that. So, signaling to them like, hey, we're eating our own dog food, so to speak. We actually understand how this stuff works and we're using it day to day. So we're not just handing over to you a bunch of stuff that a contractor built for us or that we bought from Microsoft. We are actual end users of this product. And so if you have pain, we understand your pain because we've gone through it as well. And I think that a combination of getting that kind of buy-in and also approaching it as a collaborator and not something that you just throw some data at and it gives you a response. Those two things together, I think, what's going to really drive successful companies in the upcoming, couple of years.
Wonderful, wonderful. There is a lot of food for thought, I think. It has been such an insightful conversation. So thank you so much, Arshavir, for your time.
Thanks. I have a newsletter that discusses a lot of this. I think I told you, it's called Inside the Black Box. And that's where I just discuss sort of from a mechanistic perspective so that people can get a little bit of more understanding of how these things aren't just magical boxes. And then I have Your VoiceCraft.ai, which is kind of a link to some software that I'm working on. Either of those people hopefully will get some value.
Wonderful. I'll be sure to also link them to our show notes page. Thank you, everyone. You've been listening to the Story Driven Business Podcast. My name is Susanna Rantanen, and see you again next week.